Just 1 week before her death, Princess Diana sat down for a final, haunting confession. Calm on the outside, but burning inside, she risked everything to reveal a truth the monarchy never wanted the world to hear. Behind the tiaras and fairy tale smiles was a woman imprisoned by betrayal, mental anguish, and a love triangle that shattered her soul. Her marriage wasn't just loveless, it was a calculated deception. But why now? Why did Diana speak out just days before her tragic end? Was it a warning, a cry for help, or a final act of rebellion against the crown that crushed her spirit? What she said in those final moments would change history forever. Just days before the world would lose her forever, Princess Diana sat silently, eyes locked on the interviewer. There was no crown, no palace, no forced smile, just a woman ready to tell the truth. Her voice, though measured, carried the weight of decades. The tremble in her tone wasn't fear, it was the sound of resolve. This wasn't a media stunt, it wasn't damage control. It was a final confession, and she knew it might cost her everything. She began not with anger, but with calm precision. For years, she had lived inside a myth, a fairy tale designed to dazzle the world while suffocating her behind palace walls. She was the smiling bride, the royal mother, the graceful humanitarian. But beneath it all, she had been breaking. Slowly, painfully, and now she was done pretending. Every word she spoke carried a silent thunder, revealing secrets long buried beneath layers of royal protocol and curated perfection. She wasn't just talking about a broken marriage. She was unmasking a system that demanded obedience, silence, and sacrifice. A system that had consumed her identity, her happiness, and nearly her will to live. Diana spoke not as a former princess, but as a woman clawing her way back to herself, one truth at a time. She admitted she had played the part they gave her. She wore the tiaras, waved to the crowds, and smiled through the despair. She did everything, right until the truth became too heavy to carry. Her marriage to Charles, she revealed, was never built on love. From the very beginning, there had been someone else. And she had spent her youth trying to compete with a ghost who never left the Rikii room. Camilla wasn't just a rival. She was the real connection, the one Charles never let go of, even after the vows, the titles, and the children. But Diana wasn't speaking out for revenge. Her eyes didn't burn with bitterness. They burned with liberation. Because telling her story wasn't about blaming others. It was about reclaiming the voice that had been stolen from her. For years, she had begged for help. She had screamed in silence. And now, finally, the world was listening. She spoke of her darkest moments with stunning honesty. How she turned to bulimia, how she harmed herself, how she believed she was worthless in the eyes of the man she married. But more than the pain, she spoke of the courage it took to survive. Every confession peeled back another layer of the lie she had been forced to live. She was done being the palace's perfect illusion. She was ready to be seen for who she truly was. As the final words of her interview lingered in the air, there was no applause, just silence. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with something powerful. Truth finally set free. Diana didn't know what would come next. But she knew this. If she didn't speak now, her real story would die with her. But to understand why Diana risked everything, we have to go back to the very beginning, the day her fairy tale began to crack. As she walked down the aisle, draped in silk and lace, the roar of millions cheering outside the cathedral couldn't drown out the silence inside her. Diana Spencer was about to marry the future King of England, yet beneath the grandeur and tradition, her heart whispered a different truth. Something was wrong. This wasn't the joyful beginning of a love story. It felt like the tightening of a noose. Every step she took down that aisle, every flash of a camera, every rose petal scattered in her honor, only amplified a hollow ache deep inside her chest. She was 20 years old, and already she sensed that her life was no longer hers. The fairy tale had already begun to crack before the wedding even happened. Diana, full of hope and romantic fantasy, had started to notice something cold beneath Charles's carefully rehearsed charm. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, emotionally, unavailable in a way that made her feel foolish every time she reached for his hand. His words, his silences, his sideways glances, they all carried a message she couldn't ignore. The warmth she desperately craved was missing, replaced by a strange and unsettling detachment. But still, she tried to believe. After all, wasn't this what fairy tales were supposed to look like in the real world? Then came the bracelet, a small piece of jewelry that would unravel everything she thought she understood about her future husband. Tucked away like a secret, it bore two initials, C and C, not C and D, not a symbol of their new beginning, but a quiet nod to a relationship that hadn't ended and had never truly paused. Camilla Parker Bowles wasn't just a name from Charles's past. She was the shadow trailing every step Diana took. When Diana confronted him, heart pounding, hope slipping through her fingers, he didn't deny the connection. He dismissed her as childish, silly, and insecure. He told her Camilla was just a friend, but that bracelet said otherwise. It wasn't a gift, it was a message. A message that Diana had never truly been alone with Charles, not even from the start. From that moment, Diana understood she was already the third person in her marriage, and yet she moved forward. How do you walk away from a royal wedding watched by the entire world? How do you tell the nation's fairy tale that it's already become a nightmare? She put on the dress, she smiled for the cameras, and she stepped into the golden carriage like a queen. But inside, she was a prisoner. A woman walking not into a new chapter of love, but into a carefully constructed illusion. The public saw the sparkling tiara, the lavish vows, and the fairy tale dress. But they didn't see the fear in her eyes, or the walls quietly closing in. They didn't hear the silence between her and Charles, or feel the absence of warmth where love was supposed to live. Diana had entered a golden cage, and the door had locked behind her. Even as the cameras captured her smile, Diana's heart knew she was walking into a trap, and the walls were already closing in. Behind palace doors, the real Diana began to vanish. The fairy tale had reached its pinnacle. But for her, life was unraveling behind the gilded curtains. The titles, the gowns, the royal duties, they all became tools of disguise. At public events, she appeared radiant, a beloved icon. But inside, the palaces, in the long halls and behind the heavy doors, she felt like a ghost in her own life. Charles, now her husband, remained as emotionally distant as ever. His presence was cold, calculated, and often absent altogether. The few moments they shared in private felt transactional, stripped of warmth. He was consumed by royal obligations and his unbroken bond with Camilla. For Diana, there were no warm embraces, no emotional shelter, just a growing void where love should have been. That loneliness was more than emotional. It was suffocating. Isolated from genuine connection, she found herself trapped between royal expectations and her crumbling spirit. The media, ever hungry, followed her every move, praised her style, her grace, and her role as a mother. But the same media turned a blind eye to the reality unfolding behind the camera flashes. They didn't see the woman crying herself to sleep. They didn't feel the pressure she bore when every smile had to be rehearsed, every misstep scrutinized, and they certainly didn't hear the silence she received when she begged for help. The love she hoped to grow in her marriage had not only failed to bloom, it had withered into nothingness. And Charles noticed her pain, but did nothing. Instead of leaning in, he pulled further away. His resentment toward her rising popularity began to fester. While the crowds roared for Diana, Charles seethed in the shadows. The spotlight she never asked for became a wedge between them. She had become the people's princess, not because she tried to outshine him, but because the public saw in her what the crown tried to conceal. a woman who felt, who struggled, who loved. But to Charles, her appeal was a threat. And so, every smile she gave to the world widened the gap in their marriage. The pain didn't just stay within. It began eating her from the inside. Depression sank its claws in first, followed by bulimia, then self-harm. It wasn't for attention. It was a desperate attempt to release the agony she was forbidden to express. Every meal was a battle. Every morning, a weight. She looked into the mirror and saw a shell. She wanted someone to notice, someone to intervene. But within the monarchy, silence was protocol. Vulnerability was weakness. And so, her breakdowns were hidden, her cries dismissed. The crown didn't want a woman. It wanted a statue, an unfeeling emblem of duty and decorum. Diana did what she was told. She stood by her husband's side. She posed for photographs. She played the part. But inside, she was disintegrating. The woman who once dreamed of love was now lost beneath the expectations of an institution that didn't care if she broke as long as she kept smiling. The more she conformed, the more she disappeared. Diana had become a symbol, a mask worn daily. But behind it, a woman was breaking. Camilla wasn't just in Charles's past. She was in every corner of their marriage. She lingered in silences, echoed in private jokes, haunted Diana in moments that were supposed to belong only to her. It wasn't a suspicion, it was a presence. Undeniable, permanent, and cruelly intimate. Diana had tried to dismiss it, to convince herself that the worst was behind them, that the wedding vows had somehow reset the past. But love doesn't fade for convenience, and Charles had never truly let Camilla go. Diana's heart knew it before her eyes confirmed it. And when they did, everything changed. Tucked away in his study, behind layers of official documents and royal correspondence, was a small, unassuming box. But inside, it was the truth. Letters, handwritten and brimming with emotion. Not addressed to Diana, but to him from her. From Camilla. Lines like, "She will never understand you like I do," and "I long for the day we can be as we were meant to be." They weren't just romantic whispers. They were declarations of a bond Diana had never been part of. In that moment, every unanswered question, every cold glance, every strange excuse Charles had given her suddenly made brutal sense. This wasn't an affair of the past. It was an ongoing story in which Diana had always been the outsider. She had been deceived since the beginning. The engagement, the wedding, the title, all a beautifully wrapped lie. While the public cheered, for the royal couple, behind closed doors, the real relationship Charles and Camilla had never truly ended. And Diana wasn't blind to it anymore. The world may have watched her walk into the arms of a future king, but in truth, she had walked straight into a triangle already forged in secrecy. Charles didn't just fail to protect her heart, he had never intended to. The pain of betrayal was one thing, but knowing that everyone around her saw it and remained silent, that was another kind of torment. The staff, the aides, and the household members they knew. Their glances, their tight-lipped politeness, their sudden hush when she entered a room, it was all part of the palace code. No one interferes. No one speaks. In the royal world, discretion wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Diana wasn't just fighting for love anymore. She was drowning in an institution that treated her heartbreak as collateral damage in preserving the monarchy's pristine image. Still, she stayed, not because she accepted it, but because she hoped. She fought to win the heart of a man who was never fully hers, to protect a marriage that had never stood on solid ground. But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became that Camilla had never left. Not emotionally, not secretly, not even respectfully. She was everywhere, in every unspoken word, every act of indifference, every decision that left Diana more alone than the day before. But the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Diana was up against something far more powerful than infidelity. It wasn't just Charles and Diana who were battling the entire monarchy. She had entered the royal family thinking she was becoming part of something sacred. Instead, she found herself trapped in a system built on silence, appearances, and rigid control. The palace wasn't a sanctuary. It was a fortress where truth was forbidden, vulnerability was punished, and any deviation from perfection was seen as rebellion. The moment Diana began expressing her pain, the royal machinery moved to silence her. Her suffering was an inconvenience. Her emotions, her mental health, her cries for help, none of it fit the image the monarchy wanted to project. So they erased them, or worse, twisted them. Behind closed doors, Diana was met with cold indifference. No comfort, no acknowledgement, just nods, rules, and reminders of her duty. She was expected to smile through heartbreak, to wave while bleeding internally. Her existence had become a performance. She was a royal puppet in a pageant controlled by tradition and fear. And yet, even as they tried to mold her into silence, Diana began to find something the monarchy had underestimated: purpose. In the darkest moments, she turned outward, into the world, into charity, into people who didn't ask her to hide. In hospitals, hospices, and shelters, Diana wasn't a symbol. She was human. She found connection, warmth, and the truth of who she was. With the sick, the poor, the abandoned, she rediscovered her voice. But the more the world saw her light, the more the royal family felt threatened. She wasn't following the script anymore, and the public loved her for it. They didn't see a broken woman. They saw courage, grace under fire. And that terrified the monarchy. She had become larger than the crown that tried to contain her. So they struck back, not with open confrontation, but with calculated cruelty. Stories began to appear in the press, carefully planted whispers about tantrums, instability, and erratic behavior. The palace was painting a new version of Diana, not the people's princess, but a woman unraveling. They used her struggles with bulimia as a weapon. They framed her vulnerability as madness. And all of it, Diana knew, was meant to isolate her, to discredit her, to erase the truth she was beginning to tell. They thought if they broke her spirit, they could regain control. But Diana wasn't a woman who stayed broken. Every attack made her bolder. Every smear campaign only deepened the public's empathy. The palace couldn't understand how their most rebellious member had become their most beloved. They had underestimated the power of authenticity. And now, Diana was no longer just surviving, she was watching, learning, and planning. If she couldn't find her place within the institution, she would tear down its illusions from the outside. But even as they tried to break her, Diana found strength, and a dangerous idea began to form. She couldn't change the past, but she could reclaim her story. For too long, Diana had watched others shape the narrative around her life. The palace, the press, and the courtiers all painted her in fragments. A fragile princess, a problem, a symbol of glamour with no substance. But now, after years of silence, something inside her shifted. She no longer wanted to be the figure they could control, or the headline they could twist. If they wouldn't tell the truth, she would. And this time, it wouldn't come through whispers or rumors. It would come from her voice, loud enough to rattle the gates of Buckingham Palace. She didn't act recklessly. Every step was measured, every word carefully considered. She reached out to those she trusted most: journalists, friends, secret allies, people who believed in her truth and were willing to help her tell it. With James Colthurst's help, she secretly collaborated with biographer Andrew Morton. The result? A book that exposed the cold, hidden layers of royal life, the loneliness, the betrayals, the eating disorder, the pain she had been forced to carry in silence. The public had never seen this side of her before. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw. It was vulnerable. It was real. But even that wasn't enough. The palace continued to dismiss her, attempting to spin her pain as drama. her truth as exaggeration. So she went further. In 1995, she sat down for a now iconic interview with the BBC. It wasn't just a media appearance, it was a reckoning. Her tone was calm, but her words cut through the lies that had surrounded her marriage for years. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said, almost gently. But that one line shattered the illusion the royal family had fought so hard to preserve. The truth was now undeniable. The fairy tale was a fabrication. What followed was shock, not just within the monarchy, but across the world. Millions watched, stunned, as Diana spoke with a quiet bravery that shook the foundations of the crown. She wasn't vengeful. She didn't name-call or rant. This wasn't about destruction. It was about liberation. It was about reclaiming self-worth in a world that had tried to strip it from her piece by piece. She wasn't asking for pity. She was claiming her power. And with every word, she pulled herself further out of the shadow she had been placed in. Diana had stopped being the silent wife. She had become the voice of every woman who had been told to smile through suffering, to endure what couldn't be changed. But she had changed it. Not by fighting with fists, but with truth. And just when the royal family tried to silence her, Diana raised her voice louder than ever. In death, Diana became what the crown never allowed her to be. No longer bound by royal expectations, silenced by protocols, or burdened by a role she never truly chose, she emerged as something far greater than a princess. She became a symbol, a force, a voice for the voiceless. Her final confession, delivered with grace and quiet fury, shattered the illusion of a perfect monarchy and awakened the world to a truth long hidden behind palace walls. She hadn't spoken to destroy the crown. She had spoken to reclaim herself. And in doing so, she forever altered how we see power, duty, and what it means to live with authenticity. The monarchy would never be the same. The image they had so carefully guarded, one of order, control, and tradition, was now cracked. And those fractures were not caused by scandal or rebellion, but by truth. Diana's truth. She had revealed what few dared to whisper, that behind the pageantry lay human flaws, emotional cruelty, and a system that demanded silence above all else. And once the world saw it, they could not look away. Her pain became a mirror for millions. Her courage, a beacon. But perhaps the most enduring part of her legacy lies not in what she exposed, but in what she passed on. William and Harry, her sons, watched her suffer, but they also watched her rise. They saw the cost of living under the weight of duty without love, and they chose another path. In their own lives, in their way, they have carried her spirit forward, prioritizing family over formality, love over legacy. They didn't run from her shadow. They stood in it, and then they walked beyond it, guided by her light. Diana's work, with the sick, the poor, and the forgotten, didn't end with her final public appearance. It lives on. In the landmine survivors, she hugged. In the AIDS patients, she embraced when no one else would. In every person who found hope in her touch, her gaze, and her presence. She taught the world that compassion was not weakness, that kindness could be revolutionary, and that even in a world that seeks to define you, you have the power to define yourself. Her death was a tragedy, but her life was a revolution. Diana didn't dismantle the monarchy with rage or rebellion. She changed it by being real, by crying publicly, by speaking openly, by walking into crowds instead of hiding behind walls. She gave the world a new kind of royalty, one not rooted in bloodlines, but in bravery. She showed us that you don't have to wear a crown to leave a mark that never fades. And so, a week before her tragic end, Diana's truth lit a fire no institution could extinguish. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And we will see you in the next one.